Okay, let's unpack this. Undocumented immigration in the U.S., especially right now, June 2025. It is definitely one of the most complex and, yeah, heated topics out there.
Absolutely. It touches on so much, doesn't it? The economy, laws, how we deal with other countries, and just, well, deep social divides. So many moving parts.
And thanks to you, our listener, we've got this stack of sources. They cover the latest numbers, the real challenges facing deportation efforts now, and all the unrest and conflict we're seeing.
Yeah, so our mission for this deep dive is to really cut through the noise. We want to pull out the key bits of info, the insights from this material you sent, and help you get a clearer, maybe more nuanced view of what these sources are describing.
Right. Let's jump in then. First things first, the scale. I mean, how many people are we actually talking about? Seems like the numbers themselves are, well, all over the place.
They really are. Getting a solid count, it's incredibly difficult. It's a hidden population by nature, and the sources show different ways of estimating give you pretty different answers.
Okay, so what numbers are the sources actually putting forward?
Well, you've got the Department of Homeland Security, DHS. Their estimate based on 2022 data was around 11 million. That's often used as a kind of baseline.
11 million. Okay, but like, I know that's definitely not the only number being thrown around.
Not even close. The sources point to President Trump's claims, both during the campaign and now in his second term. He's talked about 15, maybe even 20 million.
15 to 20 million? That's a huge jump from 11.
It is. And, crucially, the material you provided notes that there hasn't really been solid proof presented for those higher figures.
Right. So a big gap there between an official estimate and political claims. What about other groups? Any other estimates mentioned?
Yeah, the Center for Immigration Studies, CIS, they offer an estimate that's higher than DHS, closer to 13 or 14 million.
Okay, 13 to 14 million. Why higher?
They argue their method catches potential undercounts in official surveys better. And it tries to factor in more recent migration, stuff that might not be fully reflected yet.
Got it. And then inevitably, you get the really wild claims on social media, right? The sources mention X.
Oh yeah, some claims floating around on X push the number way up, over 40 million.
Mm-hmm.
Your sources are pretty clear. These seem, highly exaggerated and don't really have reliable data behind them.
So looking at the sources together, you've got this range, maybe 11 million from DHS, 13, 14 million from CIS, then these much higher political claims, and frankly, unsupported numbers on social media. Just that range tells a story, doesn't it? About the difficulty.
Absolutely. The material shows the differences come down to different guesses, really. How many people cross the border undetected, how many overstayed visas, how many left voluntarily. It's not like taking a census.
And the sources had that specific example, California. You'd think the number would go up there, but it went down.
Yeah, that was interesting. The estimate for California actually dropped. It was about 2.9 million back in 2010, down to 2.6 million in 2022.
Why the drop?
The sources suggest part of it might be people returning to Mexico, maybe chasing better economic opportunities there. It shows movement isn't just, one way.
Huh. That's a detail I wouldn't have guessed. The sources also really hit on the economic role this population plays.
A massive role.
Yeah.
According to the material, they're deeply woven into the economy,
Hmm.
especially in jobs like construction, farming, hospitality, often lower wage but essential work.
And there was a tax figure mentioned.
Yeah, this one stands out from your sources. They paid $96.7 billion in taxes in 2022.
Wow, $96.7 billion. That definitely challenges some common narratives. Okay, so the scale is complex, debated, and they play a big economic role. Let's pivot now. Why is President Trump, despite the promise of mass deportations, facing such hurdles? What are the roadblocks the sources identify?
Right. And what's striking in the material is that it's not just one thing. It's like a whole combination of deep-seated barriers. You've got logistics, legal challenges, international stuff, even public reaction. It makes a simple deportation operation way more complicated than it sounds. The sources break it down.
Okay, what's barrier number one?
Logistics. Just the sheer practicalities. The sources make it clear. Deporting millions needs a massive infrastructure. More detention centers, way more staff, planes, buses. It just doesn't exist on that scale right now.
And wasn't there a budget issue mentioned? Even before trying to scale up.
Exactly. Your sources point out ICE already had a $230 million budget shortfall back in December 2024. That's before any major expansion.
$230 million short just to operate normally? That's a huge constraint from the get-go.
And then there's the potential cost of the new Lake and Riley Act, passed in 2025. The sources say that could add potentially $27 billion to the bill, mostly for more detention space.
27 billion, wow.
Plus, ICE's actual capacity is limited. They can only hold around 41,000 people at any given time. That's, a tiny fraction of the numbers being discussed.
So the physical infrastructure, the money,
Yeah.
it's just not there for a massive operation like that. Did the sources compare Trump's recent deportation numbers to, say, Biden's?
They did. And this is interesting. In his first month back, Trump deported about 37,660 people, which sounds like a lot, but it's actually fewer than the average under Biden's last year. It was around 57,000 a month.
Fewer. Okay, that really highlights the challenge of ramping up dramatically. Practical reality versus ambition. What's the next barrier?
Legal battles. The sources show his tougher policies are hitting a wall in the courts. Lots of lawsuits.
What kind of policies are being challenged?
Things like trying to use the old Alien Enemies Act to deport suspected gang members, or plans to expand expedited removal, quick deportations nationwide. These are facing serious legal pushback.
How many lawsuits are we talking about?
Your sources mention over 50 major lawsuits filed already. Some are even reaching the Supreme Court.
And has the Supreme Court ruled on anything significant yet?
Yes, the sources highlight one key ruling from 2025. The Supreme Court actually blocked the use of that Alien Enemies Act for this purpose.
Okay, so the highest court is already weighing in and pushing back.
Exactly. And you have groups like the ACLU constantly filing suits, arguing people aren't getting fair hearings, due process. All this legal wrangling inherently slows the whole process down significantly.
Right. So the courts are a major break. What's the third challenge the sources point to?
International issues. This is fundamental. To deport someone, their home country has to agree to take them back.
They're not always willing.
Your sources indicate cooperation from many countries is, weak. Venezuela is mentioned specifically because of poor diplomatic ties. Deporting people there is really difficult.
So what happens then?
It leads to complicated situations. The sources note the U.S. has even explored sending some Venezuelans to El Salvador instead. Mexico, where about half the undocumented population is from, according to the sources, they are cooperating to some extent, but the material suggests they also struggle to handle large numbers coming back quickly.
Makes sense. You can't send someone back if the door's closed. That's a basic limit.
No.
Okay, hurdle number 4.
Public and economic pushback. The sources suggest trying to deport huge numbers of people who've been here a long time, working, paying taxes like we mentioned, that could seriously hurt the U.S. economy. And it sparks strong reactions from communities.
How is that pushback showing up, according to the sources?
Well, they mention a CBS YouGov poll. It showed 54% support for Trump's deportations generally. But interestingly, that support drops when you ask specifically about deporting non-criminals.
So, nuances in public opinion. What about the economy?
Farmers, businesses, they're already reporting labor shortages, according to the material. Shows how reliant some sectors are on this workforce. And in immigrant communities themselves, the sources talk about increased fear, instability, kids maybe not going to school, people spending less locally. That hits local economies too.
So the economic integration we talked about earlier means potential economic pain from mass deportations.
Got it.
And the last major roadblock.
Political opposition. Plain and simple. The sources state Trump's approach has really deepened the partisan divide. Democratic states and cities especially are actively resisting federal efforts, sometimes through lawsuits, sometimes by just not cooperating fully. That resistance itself is a major hurdle.
Which leads us perfectly into the next topic. The recent unrest. Since June 2025, things seem to have escalated, particularly in LA.
Yeah, the sources really focus on Los Angeles as a flashpoint. It apparently kicked off around June 6th. Federal agents conducted raids on businesses suspected of employing undocumented workers.
And that sparked protests.
Immediately, widespread fear, demonstrations. It seems to have really galvanized local communities there, according to the material.
How did the federal government react to the protests in LA?
The sources say President Trump responded by deploying 2,000 National Guard troops and Marines to the city.
2,000 troops and Marines. In an American city, that feels like a major step. And the sources said local leaders weren't happy.
Not at all. Highly controversial. Your sources stress this happened against the express wishes of California Governor Gavin Newsom and LA Mayor Karen Bass. They both publicly called it an abuse of power. Really highlights that state-federal clash.
So direct federal intervention met with direct state and local resistance. What about the protests themselves? Peaceful? Violent?
The sources say mostly peaceful. But there have definitely been instances of violence. Over 350 arrests reported in Los Angeles alone.
What kind of violence are we talking about?
Clashes with police, protesters throwing objects, and one really specific modern detail mentioned is protesters setting autonomous vehicles on fire.
Setting driverless cars on fire. Wow, okay. That led to curfews, I imagine.
Yes, curfews were put in place in some areas because of that kind of activity.
And was this just happening in LA?
No, the sources say similar protests popped up in other big cities too. New York, Chicago, Austin, Seattle are mentioned.
Same trigger everywhere. The ICE raids.
Partly. The sources indicate that in those other cities, thousands were also protesting a new travel ban affecting 12 specific countries. So it seems the unrest is tied to a few different strands of current immigration policy, not just the raids.
So it's a broader reaction. What did the sources suggest all this unrest signifies, fundamentally?
Basically, that it's a visible symptom of just how deep the divisions are on this issue and how intense the feelings are on all sides.
How do the sources present the different viewpoints on what's happening?
They try to show both sides. You hear from protesters, including faith leaders, calling the raids cruel, demanding they stop. They even give a specific example to humanize it. An 18-year-old student, Marcelo Gomes, reportedly picked up on his way to volleyball practice.
So highlighting the human cost from the protesters' view and the administration's perspective.
Starkly different. The sources say President Trump and his supporters framed the protests as insurrection. They talk about paid agitators. They often use language like invasion to justify the need for a strong federal, even military, response.
And those claims on X we talked about earlier, they fit in here too.
Yeah, the sources note that posts on X are pushing theories, unproven theories about foreign interference or leftist groups orchestrating the protests. It just adds another layer of conflicting narratives swirling around.
It's striking how the sources show such wildly different interpretations of the exact same events. Which brings us to that final big theme, the deep tension between the federal government and states like California. This is where the policy fight becomes about core power struggles.
Exactly. The sources frame these conflicts as fundamental. They're about power, yes, but also about deeply held beliefs regarding immigration and ultimately about how our federal system is supposed to work.
What's the central issue in that federal power versus state rights fight, according to the sources?
That decision to send the National Guard to L.A. without Governor Newsom asking for it, that was a direct challenge. Your sources highlight that specific action triggered a major lawsuit from California.
And what was California's argument in court?
Attorney General Rob Bonta argued it violated the Constitution. Basically, the governor usually controls the state's National Guard unless they're properly federalized, and Newsom hadn't requested them.
Did the sources mention how that lawsuit turned out?
Yes, they mentioned a judge, Stephen Breyer, actually ruled the deployment illegal. But, and this is key, the sources suggest the administration's defiance or continued actions despite that ruling are keeping tensions extremely high.
So a court rules against the federal action, but the conflict doesn't just go away. That shows how deep it runs. Did the Lake and Riley Act pop up again here?
It did, because while it's about immigration crimes, a key aspect the sources point out is that it empowers states to get more involved in immigration enforcement.
How does that fuel the conflict?
Well, it might empower Republican states that want stricter enforcement, but it directly clashes with the policies and philosophies of Democratic states like California that have, say, sanctuary laws. It adds another legal layer to the state-federal fight, according to the material.
Right. And sanctuary policies, they're a constant source of friction, aren't they?
Absolutely. The sources confirm this. California has statewide laws limiting local police cooperation with ICE. And the Trump administration, the sources note, has a track record of suing states like Illinois and cities like Chicago over similar policies.
So California is a big example of this ongoing battle.
Exactly. Newsom's lawsuit over the Guard, his public criticism of the raids, it all shows very strong state-level pushback against the federal approach, as described in the sources.
Beyond the legal fights, the sources emphasize this fundamental belief divide.
Yeah, this seems crucial. The material presents President Trump's view as seeing undocumented immigration, mainly as a threat to security, the economy, sometimes using that invasion language. This viewpoint logically leads to pushing for mass enforcement.
And how do the sources describe the view from leaders like Newsom or Mayor Bass in LA?
They're portrayed as focusing more on humanitarian aspects, civil rights, the impact on families. They argue the federal raids are cruel, destabilizing communities.
And the words they use about each other reflect that divide.
Definitely. Your sources mention Trump calling state resistance lawlessness, implying chaos. whereas Newsom is quoted framing federal actions as leaning towards authoritarianism, implying overreach. The language itself shows how far apart the perspectives are.
Finally, the sources connect this back to the economic and social impacts again, but in the context of this state-federal fight.
Right. California, with its huge immigrant population, is worried. The sources say they fear major economic disruption from mass deportations, losing workers, losing consumers. Mayor Bass pointed out that half of LA residents are immigrants or have immigrant roots. That explains a lot about the city's stance.
Whereas the federal argument often focuses on the strain.
Yes, the counter-argument presented in the sources is often that undocumented immigration burdens schools, hospitals, social services. So even on the tangible effects, the material shows they're framing the situation very, very differently.
Wow, okay. We have covered a lot of ground, all drawn from the sources you, the listener, provided. We've gone from just trying to figure out how many people we're talking about and seeing how disputed that is, through all the layers of challenges making mass deportation so hard. Practical logistics, legal fights, international cooperation, economic blowback, political resistance.
Yeah. To the very real unrest happening now, the clashes in cities like LA, and the fundamentally different ways people are seeing those events. And finally, digging into that core conflict between federal power and states like California, rooted in these incredibly deep divides over policy, power, and just basic beliefs.
It's crystal clear from these sources that this is not one single problem with any kind of easy answer.
Yeah.
The material really lays bare a situation with conflicting data points, huge practical obstacles, and just fundamentally opposed views on what the problem even is, let alone how to fix it.
Absolutely. The complexity is just immense, according to everything we've looked at here.
So, reflecting on everything, these sources have shown us the huge disagreements on the basic numbers, the tangled web of challenges facing enforcement on every level, and the starkly different worldviews driving the conflict between the federal government, states, and protesters. Here's something to think about, drawing directly from this material. Given these fundamental disagreements on facts, these immense practical barriers, and these clashing beliefs about the very nature of the issue, how do these sources illuminate just how incredibly difficult it is to find any common ground, any kind of consensus on undocumented immigration in the U.S. right now?